So we are back to On the Way to the Light. Let me share the screen here. Share the screen. We are going to start on the Charlemagne today. So I'll ask Zoraida to read for us. Just a reminder that this is the history of humankind through the eyes of Emmanuel, and not based on historical facts that humankind or the incarnate researchers found. So there are some differences from the history that humankind historians found, and Emmanuel's explanations from the spiritual world. So we're not trying to be historical accurate here in everything, but just an interpretation through the eyes of Emmanuel of history of humankind. Okay, so we're going to start. I believe it's page 121 on Charlemagne. Charlemagne, actually, before we start, it's Charles the Great, or Charles the Magnanimous. So Magne in French is Magnus or Great or Magnanimous. Okay, so in English it was translated into Charlemagne, but it's important to understand that it's considered Charles the Great or Charles the Magnanimous. Okay.
Okay.
Are they read for us?
Yes, Charlemagne. It is after this period that Jesus allowed the reincarnation of one of the most upstanding Roman emperors, who was eager to help the European spirit in its bitter decadence. This spirit was reborn as Charlemagne, the true reorganizer of the scattered elements needed to found the Western world. Nearly illiterate, he created the greatest traditions of strength and goodness with the loftiness that characterized his balanced and highly evolved spirit. During his 46-year reign, Charlemagne promoted education and corrected the administrative defects rampant among the disorganized peoples of Europe, thereby leaving wonderful prospects for Latinism. Jesus knew how many tears a task of such a nature would cause Charlemagne, because it would demand the highest qualities of both heart and mind. However, in anticipation of the sweet emotions awaiting him in the spirit realm, numerous invisible friends that had been at his side in the Rome of uprightness and duty surrounded him on Christmas night 800. When in St. Peter's Basilica, his thought and prayer rose to Jesus. A wave of harmonious vibrations came over the opulent environment, which was hardly propitious for demonstrations of true spirituality. Leo III, the Pope at the time, felt touched by an inexplicable spiritual rapture in approaching the great warrior of the good, adored his brow with a crown of gold as the crowd enthusiastically proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. Charlemagne too felt that the city was his. He seemed to return to the far-off past to contemplate a Rome of dignity and virtue. His soul shed tears like Jeremiah weeping over Jerusalem in his grief, thanking Jesus for his divine grace. A few years later, the great emperor once again sought the light of the spirit world and found that his efforts were falling on souls like a blessing. Nonetheless, his empire would not last very long.
Okay, so we studied that the Roman Empire was the western part of the Roman Empire was crumbling. The capital of the Roman Empire was moved to Constantinople, which is Istanbul today. And what remained in Europe at that time was an Europe completely divided by the invasions of the barbarians that we studied last month, and through the domain of kings in separate parts of Europe. So you had where France is today, and that region is called the Franks at that time. You had the Slavians, that it's part of Romania, Bulgaria, and a little of Germany. What is Germany today? You had the Bretons and Saxons. Saxons where Holland is today, and Belgium. And in Britain, you have the Bretagne, that was a small part of France today, that was part of the British Empire. So it was all divided. So the proposal from the spirits to unify the world culturally and spiritually was all torn into pieces by the destruction of the western part of the Roman Empire. Then comes Charlemagne, Charles the Great, and he became the king of the Franks in 768, that part that is nowadays France for most of it. The first thing here that Emmanuel says is that he was the reincarnation of one of the most upstanding Roman emperors. Of course, you know, for us to be speculating which Roman emperor he was the reincarnation of, it's not really the purpose here, but just the parenthesis here. Most likely would be either Augustus, who was the first Roman emperor and considered the best Roman emperor, or Julius Caesar, who later was Napoleon, that was not really an emperor. He was the one that put together the Roman Empire, but he was the last of the rulers of the Roman Republic, and his great nephew, that was Augustus, succeeded him as a dictator, and then he became the first emperor. So Emmanuel doesn't say anything here. I couldn't find anything else, but you know, the most upstanding Roman emperors would be probably Augustus, but we'll leave it at that. So he was reborn as Charlemagne, and he began putting together what the pieces of what was left of the Western Roman Empire, and he had a 46-year reign. So in 774, he became also the king of the Lombards. And then here, when Emmanuel says that he was in Rome in Christmas night in 800, when he was proclaimed the emperor of the Romans, and that was the Carolingian Empire. And Leo III, the Pope at that time, was the one that put the crown on him, and according to Emmanuel, it came from the spiritual world. He was a very religious person, Charlemagne, so he was praying, and he was surrounded by the spiritual guidance and protection, and he was crowned the emperor of the Romans by the Pope at that time. In terms of historically, what we find is that the Pope at that time was not happy with the emperor of the eastern part of the Roman Empire that dominated all Eastern Europe, plus Asia, what is Turkey today, plus the south of Italy. And this was a woman at that time. So it is said by historians that he wasn't happy to have a woman as the emperor of the other side. So he decided to crown Charlemagne as the emperor of the Romans. So he unified the western part of the Roman Empire, and he was, as Emmanuel says here, and it's confirmed by the historians, he promoted education, he built administrative organization that was very advanced for that time, and he really created something of a Europe that was somewhat related to the Roman Empire. But as Emmanuel says here, it didn't last very long. After he died, it was all divided again, and we ended up with feudalism. But another thing to mention here is that Emmanuel talks about Jeremiah weeping over Jerusalem. Jeremiah was one of the ancient prophets of the Jewish civilization, and he was a prophet, and he was the one that prophesies the destruction of Jerusalem that happened in 730 after the Common Era. So he is considered a prophet on the Jewish beliefs, on the Christian beliefs, and on the Muslim beliefs. So he's considered a prophet on all the three major religions, Eastern religions. And it's said that one day he woke up weeping on a dream that he had, on a prophecy that was the destruction of Jerusalem. So that's why Emmanuel talks about here that Charlemagne shed tears like Jeremiah weeping over Jerusalem in his grief. Okay?
Yes.
That's it from Charlemagne. Any questions, comments here? Okay. Let's go to feudalism.
Okay. Feudalism. After the remarkable advances of Athens in matters of administrative policies and those of Rome in matters of law, it is hard to understand the reason for feudalism, which extended throughout Europe from the 8th to the 12th centuries, a fact that seems to be historian to be a retreat of an entire civilization. All political unity disappeared during that time of vivid memories for humankind. Private ownership had never attained such importance, and moral servitude had never gained such a strong impulse. Under such a regime, fratricidal battles had an open field on European soil, fighting for hegemony that could never be arrived at by means of bellicose activities. Only the few Christian qualities of the Catholic Church were able to mitigate the tragic character of the situation by implementing the so-called God's truces, which forced warriors to take a break on certain days of the week to commemorate the passages of the life of Jesus Christ, thus defending the peace with the periodic cessation of hostilities.
Okay. So after Charlemagne, we enter into feudalism period. Feudalism, what was feudalism? Was a regime where you had owners of land in their own castles with and you would had people working for them in exchange of living in the land and taking care of the land. They would give part of their profit, actually a large part of their profit, to the feudal master, who in exchange would protect them against the external world, let's say, against invasion. So you had Europe divided in many castles with their own small lands, and we see this when we see movies about the Middle Ages. it was it's called the dark era, or the dark time for humanity, because there was really not much progress that was achieved at that time. All the progress that, as Emmanuel says here, when you had all the remarkable advances of Athens in terms of everything, democracies appeared in Athens. So in terms of administrative policies, what the Greek Empire left for us that's still used today, and then Rome in terms of law, we still use Roman law nowadays. Most countries still use Roman law. A lot of laws of different countries is based in Roman law. So Emmanuel is telling us here, it's hard to understand how this all could be lost for so many centuries. He says here between the 8th and the 12th centuries, but we know that actually it lasted until a little bit more than that, until we had the Renaissance, until we had a Black Plague that destroyed the feudalism system and opened the doors for the Renaissance. That it was really what started our progress at that time. But you know, we also have to analyze that humankind lived through wars all the time. So fighting was all we knew, invading neighbors and dominating neighbors and then being invaded back. And so at that time, we were always fighting. So even the feudal owners, they would, as much as possible, have their own armies to conquer their neighbors. And so the relevance of the church there, the Catholic Church or the Christian Church, was that they had the Pope that had their own lands, and we'll talk a little bit about it later, and the religious dominance over the world. So most of the feudal castles and lords respected the Pope as the religious leader and would follow the Pope's instructions in terms of religiosity. They all contributed a little bit to, most of them contributed a little bit to the church. And so the only thing that the church could do at that time was convince them of this, and it's here that it's not really God's truths, is the truth of God. Okay, the word is the truth of God, which is a measure by the medieval Roman Catholic Church to suspend warfare during certain days of the week and during the period of certain church festivals and Lent. So that started around the year 1000. And they suspended wars from Saturday night until prime time on Monday. And then by 1000, around 1050, was extended from Wednesday evening to Monday morning in every week, and also in most places. It lasted during the seasons of Lent and Advent, the feasts of Blessed Virgin and those of the apostles. So the truth of God was decreed in the Synod of Fairwan in 1063, and it lasted for until more or less the end of these dark ages. Of course, not everyone respected it, and you would have some owners of landowners taking advantage of it, but basically they were able to at least limit the amount of fight and war that happened at that time. You know, when you don't have to, on the days of that you have this truce, people could live on with their lives and especially go to church, which is what the main objective of it was. Okay. Questions, comments here? We're going to talk a little bit more about feudalism, but there is, you know, the important part here is the situation of Europe. So, and just also what was happening on the other side. The Eastern Roman Empire, which the capital was Constantinople, continued to exist, but was already being attacked by the Arabs from many sides, and the Arabs dominated part of what's the Eastern Empire. So the Eastern Empire was really only Turkey, the south of Italy, and a little bit of Eastern Europe, where is Romania and Bulgaria and that that area. So it was also being reduced, and eventually would end with the invasion of the Arabs and I think around the 1200. Okay.
João,
Yes.
What's your view regarding this? I find it surprisingly positive. The way Emmanuel here presents the Catholic Church. I mean, well, we're talking about a time when the Pope was a warrior. He was essentially a concentrator of power. He was out there fighting with everybody, and he talks about the qualities of the Catholic Church. And we know that he's not actually a lover of the Catholic Church. So isn't this sort of surprising? How do you see this?
Wait for the next chapter.
Okay.
You and Manuel will talk a lot about the shortcomings of the church in the next chapter. Here he's just mentioning the role of the positive role of the church at the times of the feudalism, in terms of at least sustaining a little bit of normalcy and some sort of spirituality, conservation of spirituality over the different feudal masters, so to say. So we'll get there. Actually, reasons for feudalism is the last item of this chapter, and then we go into, you'll see by the title of the next chapter how much he already starts with the church. Okay.
Yep. Reasons for feudalism. Feudalism may be easily explained, however. Charlemagne's mission had been organized by the invisible plane as one of the largest attempts to reorganize the empire of the West. But upon observing the uselessness of the attempt due to the hardness of most hearts, the spiritual authorities under Christ's aegis renewed the educational processes of the European world, at the time just starting today's civilization, by calling all human beings to life in the field, so that by tilting the soil and being in contact with nature, they could learn more effectively. Only feudalism could accomplish this, and its norms, although crude but profitable and pain-filled school of spiritual acquisitions, where thought and sensibility would surface to build the millenary edifice of Western civilization.
So Emmanuel here tries to explain to us why it happened, feudalism. When we fail to progress spiritually, morally, spiritually, what was important was, according to Emmanuel, to go back to the basics. So going back to the basics is life in the field, by tilling the soil and being in contact with nature. So instead of great civilization in terms of large cities and that existed at the Roman Empire and all that progress that came with it, we failed to reach moral and advancement with that. We achieved a lot of intellectual advancement, but we couldn't reach any spiritual moral advance. So we lost that opportunity and had to go back to taking care of the soil, of being in contact with nature. It's, you see nowadays people talking about it a lot. Some people that wanted to go back to contact with nature, that want to move away from civilization. It's a marginal movement, but it exists in society nowadays. And if you think of that at that time, so all intellectual progress was not really lost, but it was put aside because we know that we continue progressing. But people at that time, they didn't have access to it. Most of the intellectual knowledge was confined inside the churches and inside the castles. And people would live their lives either taking care of the soil or being in the army fighting against their enemies and neighbors. And again, a couple of facts about this time that I think it's important for us to remind ourselves of how was life at that time. The amount of knowledge that one average person would have at that time amount to less than one edition of the New York Times. If you read one edition of the New York Times today, you would have more information and knowledge of someone at the Middle Ages would have in their whole lives. Also, the average person in Middle Ages would spend their whole life where they were born, and the maximum they would travel was 30 miles outside of where they live. They would never have average person. Okay, of course there are exceptions, but average person will live and die where they were born and actually not travel more than 30 miles from where they were born in their whole life. The longest trip they would take maybe once in their life is like 20, 30 miles from where they lived, and that was it. So you have, this is for us to put in perspective what was life at that time. You would work the soil from morning until dawn, from Monday to Saturday, and then on Sunday you would go to church. We would do nothing but go to church. That was the control that the church had amongst that. They would have the festivities 2-3 times a year, as I mentioned before, Lent, Advent. That was really big religious congregations that the Lord of the land would take care of this, promoting it and reuniting the people and making sure that people were subservient to him because he was a lord, not a lady, and almost all the time. And that was their life. They would die of some plague, of some disease when they were in their 50s, probably. The average life was less than 35 years, but you have to consider that the average life considers a lot of babies that would die as they were born. So a family of 6 would normally, if a couple would have 6 children, 2 or 3 would die at birth, and many times also the woman would die at birth. So that's why the average is so low. Actually, those that ended up surviving, not dying in birth, would live on average 50 years or between 45 and 55 years old. Of course, there are exceptions, those that live more, but when we talk about the average life of 35 years old, it's important to remember that you average with a lot of babies dying at birth. Okay, anything here? It's a lot of historical facts, but I think it's important for us to understand what was going on there. So okay, so now we go to, yes.
Oh, we're essentially books unavailable, or were they actually not allowed for the common person? Were they extremely hidden or kept by the church primarily?
They were hidden and kept by the church, but more important than that, nobody knew how to read. Only the lords and their families would learn how to read and write. The commoners wouldn't know how to read and write. So they would, and the church, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit. All the books were in Latin. So, and they all spoke dialects, so they wouldn't understand the books. They wouldn't understand the masses because they were also said in Latin. So normally the mass would be in Latin, with the sermon being spoken in the language of that they would understand. So they would only understand what the priest told them in a very small part of the mass, and on that sermon is when they brought the notions of heaven, hell, and purgatory to scare them. So if you read how was a mass at that time, we think of a mass today that people go there and stay quiet and pray. Actually, mass at that time was not at all like that. It was very a lot of people would go to mass drunk, because that was the only thing that they knew what to do. They would talk a lot because they couldn't understand anything that was said. So there was a lot of noise. A lot of people had to be removed from mass because they were disturbing it. So the idea that we have nowadays, that all people would go to mass and they would stay quiet listening for mass in Latin for an hour or 2 hours, it's not really the reality. The reality was a very noisy conversation, loud mass that people had to be removed because they were too drunk, and very few really religious people that understood what was being said by the priest. And of course, you had different, you have the main chapel of the castle of the Lord would be only for the family to go there, and that would be the mass for the privileged. And then you have a larger mass for all the people there in a larger church, also inside the castle or around the castle, where you have all this very confusing actual mass. Okay, but to answer your question, nobody really knew how to read or write.
Right.
Oh, thanks, John. That's great. Thank you.
Okay, so here we go, Luis. The abuses of religious power. The title already says it.
Faces of the Catholic Church. In spite of the many aberrations of the Roman Church, who have forgotten the Christian principles as soon as it was summoned to the offices of the world's politics, Catholicism was never completely abandoned by the powers of the good and the spirit world. Countless warnings were sent to it throughout its history by the mercy of Christ, who took pity on the impiety of those who, in his name, settled the church's altars. While it was subject to the emperors of Constantinople, the Catholic Institute strove to free itself of such worship, seeking the broadest spiritual independence possible. It was successful only during the papacy of Stephen II, with the organization of the so-called Patrimony of St. Peter in 756. At that time, many sovereigns made use of the church according to their personal desires, granting ecclesiastical titles to the most corrupt consciences. The seat of Catholicism had become a huge market for all sorts of titles of nobility. Even after the 10th century, the situation of moral disaster continued to increase at an alarming rate. In the light of the infinite, the apostles of the divine master deployed such displays of spiritual corruption and arranged for the reincarnation of a large number of collaborators for a redemptive endeavor in the ranks of the rule of Saint Bernadette. These missionaries of the truth and the good began laboring for restoration at the monastery of Cluny, from which new thoughts and regenerative energies emerged.
So here, Emmanuel starts to talk a little bit about the abuses of the church. So the aberrations of the Roman Church that, of course, once it become a political power, it left behind a lot of the Christian principles and a lot of the teachings that Jesus brought to us. But of course, from the spiritual side, when you try to preserve something that is important for humanity, some sort of spirituality, the superior spirits had to work through the church because that was the best instrument available for the continuation of some sort of spirituality in the church. So what Emmanuel says here, that you remember that Constantinople was the capital of the empire, and that's where Istanbul is today. But the church was still in Rome, and the Pope was in Rome, but the church had very little power being so far from Constantinople. So the popes start to fight in both in the war sense and in the political sense for some independence and some sort of political domination. So you have Stephen II, when he mentions here the patrimony of St. Peter and Stephen II. Stephen II was the patrimony of St. Peter is landed possessions and revenues of various kinds that belong to the Pope or the Church of St. Peter. That's why it's called Patrimony of St. Peter. So until the middle of the 8th century, everything was private property. But then at that time, it's when the church started to own land in terms of for the gaining of some political power. So that's what's called the patrimony of St. Peter, and it started during the papacy of Stephen II. So wealthy families would donate land to the church in exchange of blessings, protections, and of course you see here when he talks about it became a huge market for all sorts of titles of nobility, for selling places in heaven for the nobility, and really the corruption that we know that it's rampant in the church for so many centuries, right? But the church began to become richer in terms of having more land, and with land, the popes could have an army, the popes could defend their lands, and started to expand the power of the church, which, it's not exactly what the spirits thought for the church, but the idea here is that for the church to survive in some form, it had to have some power, and of course we go from the wrong, we take the wrong path, but in terms of survival of the church, that's what was important at that time. But of course, our spiritual benefactors were not very pleased with that, and a lot of missionaries reincarnated at that time. Many of those missionaries we don't know about them, but we know about this rule of Saint Benedict, which is a very important movement that started with Benedict of Nursia, that lived in around the year 500, and he set a set of rules for monks living communally. And why it's important? Because the basics, the motto of the Benedicts was peace and work. So at that time, you had many religious people isolating themselves from the world so they wouldn't be contaminated by what's happening in the world. And you still see that today, right? Where monks isolate themselves from the world in order to not be contaminated. The rule of Saint Benedict tell them that they have to pray, but it's a moderate path between individual zeal and formulaic institutionalism. So middle ground, which is always the most important path. So he would say that the monks needed to live in a community environment. So they would need to pray in isolation, but live their lives, their ascetic lives, and that's very important also, but helping the community and working with the community for the involvement of the community. So that's what is important, and that's why Emmanuel mentions it here, because at that time you would have either the monks isolating themselves from the world, and you have people that will go, the commoners will go to the church, but would have no contact with the religious people, basically. So with the Benedictines that continue to exist until today, the monks have to work together with the population in order to help the population. Okay. Of course, with that came also celibacy that at that time existed, and we're going to talk a little bit about it on the next chapter when we talk about Gregory VII. But that's what's important about Saint Benedict here and the Benedictines, is the middle ground. You divide your life between prayers and working for the community, okay? Different from what we see in many religious people that just isolate themselves and work only for their own abbey or their own religious community, not for the general public. And that's what the Benedictines been doing for this since they were created, okay? Comments, questions here? No? Everybody's very quiet today. Oh, man. Okay, Gregory VII.
Okay. It was during this activity of restoration that Hildebrand, known as Gregory VII, hearkened to the inspirations that descended to his heart from the invisible plane and prepared himself for the mission awaiting him in the Vatican. He was one of the most important figures of the 11th century because of the faith and sincerity that characterized his attitudes. Elected Pope after the discarnation of Alexander II, he realized that his first job was to combat simony within the Catholic institution and to reestablish the authority of the Church. He truly wanted to lead it back to the bosom of Christianity, even though his ongoing strife with Henry IV might seem to the contrary. He convened a council in Rome in 1074 to curb the enormity of the abuses involving the selling of the sacraments and ecclesiastic titles. Philip I and Henry IV promised to support the Pope's decisions regarding regenerating the organization of the church. However, pressured by bishops guilty of simony, Henry reneged on his promise, and after being reprimanded by Gregory, he tried to dispose him by calling a synod of corrupt ecclesiastics at Worms. The Pope excommunicated the rebellious emperor, resulting in the famous events at the Canossa. The struggle had not yet been resolved when Gregory departed this world in 1085. Although he had prepared the way for the Concordat at Worms, held in 1122 with Henry V, resulting in the independence of the church, along with some regeneration of its disciplines.
So why Emmanuel talks about Gregory VII? He was one of the most important popes at that time, one of the great reforming popes. He was important because he, as Emmanuel says here, he tried to combat simony or simony. I don't know if it's, I think it's simony, yes. What is simony? Very important. Simony is the sale of, is the act of selling church offices and roles or sacred things. It's named after Simon Magnus, who is described in the Acts of the Apostles as having offered 2 disciples of Jesus payment in exchange for their empowering him. So the act of selling things of the church, and we know that is very famous, how much the church sold all sorts of things, promising absolution, promising better places in the spiritual world. So this was widespread in the church at that time. And Gregory VII entered to fight it strongly against it, to try to at least eliminate it in parts of it. So who are Philip I and Henry IV? Philip I was the king of France at that time, and Henry IV was the king of what is today Germany. So he was king of, Henry IV was the Roman emperor and king of Germany, and also king of Italy. He was, very important at that time. And what Gregory VII here tried to do was, with the help of Philip I and Henry IV, the most important kings of the time, to combat this corruption of the church. And they agreed with him in principle, but Henry IV, influenced by a lot of bishops that on his reign that were very corrupt, decided to go against Gregory and try to fight him. He was excommunicated, as they say here, and they went back and forth till the end of his life, of Gregory's life. And he succeeded somewhat to control Henry's political ambitions, but Henry IV actually achieved a lot of success in fighting against Gregory. They actually, Henry IV nominated an anti-pope or an alternative to the Pope. The Pope excommunicated him, named another king to the Germans. So they spent their whole life back and forth with this fight. But in the end, he laid out a better situation after when he died. It was a more peaceful organization that he left. He also was very strong in imposing the policy of celibacy. So why should we discuss celibacy here? Celibacy in the church was something that was mandated but not completely followed. There were a lot of priests at the time that had wives, kids. There was a lot of you know, we see celibacy being not respected until today by priests and by the religious people of the Catholic Church. But later, after Renaissance and later, it was everything was hidden. At that time, it was not hidden. The priests were married, they lived with their wives and their kids. Celibacy was said to be voluntary only. And Pope Gregory VII was one that tried to impose and to force it more in the priests, and try to remove priests that refused to live in celibacy. And why celibacy was important for the church? It's political. Because the church had lands and the priests were in charge of lands, the church was afraid that when the priests would die, they would leave their lands for wives and children instead of going back to the church. If the priests were not married and had no families, the land would go back to the church, and the church would prevent the loss of land. So that's the main reason celibacy was important for the church. You won't find celibacy in Jesus' teachings. You won't find celibacy in the apostles' teachings. That's something that was created by the church later. I don't know exactly when, but you know, it's a voluntary act of being unmarried and sexually abstinent. Okay, the origins of celibacy. You know, there are other religions that impose celibacy also, but it's something that it was imposed later by the church. But you find in other religions also. You find it in Buddhism. You find it in the Islamic. In some sects of the Islamic religion. Some Sufi embrace it, some condemn it. So it's a controversial discussion that the religions have. It's, you know, what according to Spiritism is not natural. That's what we say, right? We human beings, celibacy is an act that you can do voluntarily if you do it out of your own volition and out of your own desire to preserve yourself. But what's important is really what's inside. Not your external acts do not dictate what's inside of your own mind. So you know, when you talk about it, you have to study and understand it in a more ample way, and not in the sense of forbidden, because everything that is forbidden becomes tempting in the end. Okay. Any comments, questions here on Gregory VII on this time of the church?
Question, Johnny.
Yes.
You probably did research on this, so you might know. I wonder if at this moment in time in the low Middle Ages, the church was already doing something that I think it's key. That was the preservation of knowledge, because they were literate. I wonder if they were already in the abbeys, in the congregations, preserving knowledge their way, throwing away what they didn't like, but essentially being the bridge from the antiquity to the Renaissance. Were they already doing this?
Yes, they were.
Can I just say something to you? I'm
Sure.
going to send you a link to an Amazon book that talks exactly about that. It's a fascinating story about how Irish monks were the ones responsible for preserving all the books from antiquity until the development of the church. I'm going to look for it right now, and I'll send it in the link for everybody.
I would appreciate
Thanks,
that. Thank you.
Thanks, Fabio. Yes, yeah, you're absolutely right. What we have today of literature, from ancient literature and from the Middle Ages, everything was preserved by the monks. Yes, a lot of was lost, of course, and as you said, a lot of was thrown away. But even forbidden texts, that you find monks that hid the forbidden texts so they were not destroyed, and they were preserved. So a lot of our history today is known by documents preserved by the monks and the abbeys of that time. And and yes, and there you go. How Irish saved civilization. Very good, Fabio. Thank you.
Thanks.
Sure.
Anything else here? So,
Okay. Jesus's warnings. And ensconced in immense riches, the possessing all power and authority, the church rarely grasped the duty of love that its educational mission entailed. Accustomed to unrestricted authority, it often received warnings from Jesus in the form of condemnable heresies, which it felt it had to combat and destroy. The exhortations from the higher realms were felt not only amongst the religious orders, where humble penitents provided their proud ecclesiastical superiors with the holiest lessons on Christian piety. In civil society, too, the seeds of light were bringing forth the most hopeful shoots of comprehension and the wisdom regarding the gospel and the examples of Christ. One such person was Peter the Boggs, a lion businessman who, touched by Jesus' example and his gospel of love and redemption, shed all the cords that bound him to the human riches and rid himself of all his assets to help the poor and needy. Invested with the mission as an instrument of the Lord's will, this remarkable man ordered and translated of sacred books for public reading, and along with other companions who went down in history with the name Waldensians, he began a widespread movement of the evangelical preaching in the matter of apostolical times. The poor of Lyons were excommunicated first by the city's archbishop and then by the Vatican in 1185. The church could not tolerate any doctrine other than its own pride and badly disguised ambition. Any true and sincere reminder of its divine founder was taken as an abominable heresy, successible of the hardest punishment. The truth is, however, that even though the Waldensians were persecuted by the Catholic forces, their preaching and appeals never disappeared after the 1100s, because under various names, their organization subsisted throughout Europe and until Reformation, in spite of the iron glow of the Inquisition.
okay, so here Emmanuel is talking to us about the missionaries that the higher realms sent to us to try to preserve the teachings of Jesus and continue disseminating the true teachings of Jesus. And what's important here is this Peter de Vaux was a businessman from Lyon, that he created this movement called the Waldensians. That is a movement that Waldensians that still exists today. Okay, it's also called the Valences or Vaudois. It's a precursor of the Protestant Church that began with him in around 1100 83, 85, as it says. It says 1170s, 1180s. So he was a businessman that when entering into contact, it's not clear exactly what happened to him, but he went through a personal experience that put him in contact with Jesus' teachings, and he left everything that he had for his wife and his heirs, and went to disseminate the teachings of Jesus in the most simple way. He was the first one who translated the sacred books from Latin into the languages that people could understand. And for that, he was excommunicated, because he started a movement of explaining the teachings of Jesus in a language that everyone understood. And that's exactly what happened later with the Protestant Reformation, with Martin Luther, that started to translate the Bible. And so the origin of the movement, of this movement, of what eventually became the Protestant movement, was here with the Waldensians in 1185. He was, of course, persecuted, because the church would persecute everyone that would try to defy the dogmas of the church. He would fight against some dogmas of the church, saying that the dogmas were imposed, and he fought for religious diversity. He fought for freedom of conscience, interreligious work, social justice. Sounds familiar?
Yeah.
You know. So you see that what things that we have today, they're not new. People were fighting for this in 1,000 years ago. Just out of curiosity, you still have a Waldensian church in Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay today, evangelical Waldensian church. Okay, and you still have some remnants of it in Europe, in the northern Italy, and some Protestant churches of Europe still use his teachings. Most of his teachings were actually diversed into the Calvinists. Okay, the Calvinists is a major branch of Protestantism that follows the theological traditions and forms of Christian set by John Calvin and other Reformationaries. So a lot of the Waldensians became merged with the Calvinists later. But you know, the idea here is that he tried to fight the domination of the church and the imposition of the church. So to bring the teachings of the church and to the poor and to the masses, which was not what the church wanted. The church wanted the knowledge to be preserved inside the church, and for people to follow the church out of fear and not out of reason. And of course, we know that it's this fear only works for a certain time, but you know, his Peter DeVoe, his name, his translation into English is Peter Waldo. So that's why the Waldensians, okay? Where does Waldensians come from? Okay, anything here? Okay. So next we talk about Francis of Assisi, and you know, everyone knows about him.
Yes.
But and about the Franciscans, our Pope nowadays is a Franciscan, is the first Pope that is a Franciscan.
Okay. Francis of Assisi. The appeals from the higher realms continue to solicit the Roman Church's attention in every quarter. So-called heresies broke out wherever there were free and sincere hearts. But the Catholic authorities were never open to receiving such exhortations. The 20-year war against the heretics ended in 1229, when a number of the church's leaders considered the opportunity of setting up a tribunal of penitence, whose planning had concerned the Vatican for quite some time. This enterprise would be discussed under the pretext of the need for religious unification. But in reality, the institution wanted to expand its vast control over consciences. However, if the Inquisition had for so long concerned the authorities of the church before it was actually set up, this evil plan also worried the spirit world, where measures of educational renewal were being prepared. To that end, one of Jesus' greatest apostles reincarnated as Francis of Assisi. His great and illuminous spirit shone near Rome in the region of desolate Umbria. His reformist activity took place without the sparring over words per se, because his priesthood was an example lived out in poverty and complete humility. Even so, the church failed to grasp the fact that his lesson was meant for it, and once more refused a gift from Jesus.
Okay, so here we're talking about one of the most important figures of Christianity, Francis of Assisi. He created a movement that has followers up to today. He was born in a wealthy family, and he had a when he was young, he lived the life of a wealthy young man. He used fine clothes, he spent money, he was very, lived a normal life for young people, rich young people at the time that he was born. He was born in 1181 or 1182. But through military expedition, he joined a military expedition when he was around 20, and he was taken prisoner and spent a year as a prisoner. And then there he got ill, and through this illness, he reevaluated his life. That's where his spiritual conversion started. And during a second army expedition in 1205, he had a vision that, and that vision made him lose his taste for the worldly life, is what he said. But actually, he had a vision and an experience with the higher spirits, and through that, he received the message of what his work would have to be. Again, always remembering that we have our free will and we make choices. He made the choice to follow the vision and to follow the message from the high realm. And he decided to move away from the life he was living and live in poverty and work to the rebuild of the church. The message he received was he said it was from Jesus that told him to build his church, to rebuild his church. First, he understood that he had to physically rebuild a church that was destroyed there in that region that he lived in, Assisi, and he started rebuilding the church. But eventually, he understood that rebuild the church was in the spiritual sense, and that's what he started the movement of spreading the teachings of Jesus through the work, this humble work, through poverty. He lived with only survived with donations. He lived a very simple life. He started having followers, many followers. One of the followers was Claire, that became his spiritual companion in life. Claire, that we know is Joanna de Angelis today. And they worked together. They did not have any physical relationship. They were spiritual companions. This is very important to say, because Francis became completely ascetic in his life. And he eventually went to Rome on a pilgrimage. He presented his case to the Pope, and the Pope actually was very impressed by him, but couldn't attend his appeals. And so he continued to work in his humble and life, and continue to lead by example. And he eventually returned to Assisi, and he ended up in the Porciuncula, which is a little chapel below the town of Assisi, where he spent most of his time. He founded the Order of the Franciscans that still exists today, and he was, of course, one of the most important figures of Christianity, and still today is respected and revered as an example of how to really follow the teachings of Jesus. Ju, I know he's very close to your heart. You want to talk a little bit about him?
Yes, sure. I just said that it's close to my heart, not talk to. No, I'm not going to say anything.
Okay. Anyone else? Any comments?
João, in your opinion, can we say that his vision was a mediunic experience?
Yes, I'm sure it was. Absolutely. He according to the vision that he had, is you get it here. He was told to rebuild the church. I lost here the exact words, but he said that he had this vision where he met Jesus, right, in this vision, and Jesus told him to rebuild his house. Here, he had a mythical vision of Jesus Christ in the chapel of San Damiano, just outside Assisi, and the icon of the Christ crucified told him, Francis, go and repair my house, which, as you can see, is falling into ruins. And he first thought that this ruined church where he was praying was the one that he had to rebuild. And he sold some things that his father had from his father's store to rebuild. And when he found that it was not this, he understood that he had to rebuild the church in the spiritual sense of it, and that's how he did. But I'm not sure it was a mediumistic experience, or at least a trance experience. It's an out-of-body experience that you can call mediumistic or trance or something like that. Okay. Okay, the Franciscans.
Yes. The powerful efforts of this missionary may not have been able to change the current of the ambitions of the Roman popes, but it did leave shining vestiges of his passage on the planet. His example of simplicity and love, of humility and faith, affected many individuals who took up the holy task of regenerating souls for Jesus. The Franciscan order at one point was made up of more than 200,000 missionaries and followers of the great spiritual leader. They refused any kind of monetary help and accepted only the most meager and basic nourishment. But the characteristic that the most distinguished them from other religious orders was that they did not live in monasteries. Instead of resting in the obscurity of cloisters, in tranquility and meditation, these selfless spirits realized that the best way to pray to God was through constructive work aimed at making the world and hearts better.
Okay. So again, we go back to the Waldensians, right? What was important about the Franciscan order was that they worked, they did not live in monasteries. They worked and helped those in need. They helped the lepers, they helped the poor, they lived in the middle of those in need. And that's what's important, the simplicity, humility, and faith. They didn't accept any kind of monetary help. They only accepted nourishment. And at a certain point, and he says here, the Franciscan order was made of more than 200,000 missionaries and followers. He was canonized only 2 years after he died by Pope Gregory IX. So even if his work was not accepted and recognized by the church while he was alive, at the time of his death, he was already one of the most important missionaries already recognized by the church and was canonized very early. Along with Saint Catherine of Siena, he's the patron saint of Italy until today. And for those that have the opportunity to go to Assisi, it's a wonderful, beautiful place to visit. His chapel, his small chapel in Porciuncula is something out of this world, and the energies and that you feel at that place is really something also. So of course he was one of the most important missionaries that Jesus sent to us. It is said that he was actually John, the Apostle John, a reincarnation of the Apostle John, the one that took care of Jesus' mother until her death. So that was St. Francis of Assisi and the Franciscans. So the Pope, our Pope today, is a Franciscan, and you can see by his acts on simplicity, on his ideas, on his teachings, how he still follows the basic lessons of the Franciscans in terms of simplicity and in terms of serving the people. Okay, we're going to stop here. We're not going to enter into the Inquisition because we should live on high ground, which is the Francis of Assisi, and not go down into the Inquisition. Let's leave that for the next month. If you have any comments.
Thank you, João. Yeah, don't spoil the environment. So beautiful.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my gosh. Thank you.
That's what I thought. I thought we shouldn't go into Inquisition because it's really a very dark age of humanity, the Inquisition that lasted so long. And we're still paying the price for it, many of us.
Oh my gosh, yes.
So we are going to leave it with St. Francis of Assisi and the Franciscans. Okay.
Yes.
Anyone wants to say anything else?
Can you share with us? Can you share with us a little more about Claire?
Claire. Sinclair, right? That let me see if I have something else. I didn't look anything specifically. I can talk about Joana de Angelis, but
Do you want to know about Sinclair?
general.
Well, she was very devout since she was very young, and she was friends with Francis. And when Francis decided to follow the monastic life, she was inspired by his actions as well, and she started doing the same thing. And but she wanted to follow him. But they soon realized that, especially at that time, it would not be that much accepted for, women to be mingled with men. And so it was him that advised her to form a new order, the same way that he had the Franciscans that followed him. She started a new order of Clarissas. I don't know exactly when the names, because I'm sure that neither Francisco nor Clara has decided to call an order their own name. You see, probably was something that others came with this denomination. And so she started doing that and working with other women that had this, followed the same call as she did, but they were always very close. They lived in the same region. They followed the same ideas, and they had this, pure love and ideal that they share among themselves. And so and both of them, of course, were examples that continue to be followed by others, and that's why they established both order of Franciscans and Clarissas that we have up to this day.
So a little bit more on her. She when she went to Francis and they decided that it was not good to have her in the group because of course of women at that time. Francis placed her in the convent of the Benedictine nuns in São Paulo near Bastia in Italy. So the Benedictines were already, we talked about them. So she started working there, and other women joined them in the church. Later, when a dwelling was built near the church of San Damiano, and they became known as Poor Ladies of San Damiano, that eventually became the Clares. The Clares went after her. But one interesting thing is that two of her sisters, Beatrix and Catarina, also went with her to the monastery. And Catarina later took the name Agnes and became a saint herself, Saint Agnes. So Saint Agnes is a sister of Clare, which also became a saint, of course. Saint Clare of Assisi is a saint. So that's the Order of Poor Ladies of San Damiano became the Order of Saint Clare after her death.
Thank you. I did not know most of that. Thank you so much. And I hadn't even associated Clare with Saint Clare. Thank you, Johnny.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So I'll stop here. Elmo.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes. What do we have next week, next Sunday?
Oh, I think it's gonna be a Q&A.
Okay. So next Sunday.
I was gonna try to prepare something, but my schedule not gonna allow me to do it.
So we still have 2 Sundays on this month. We are going to do the Q&A in the last Sunday of the month, because we have 5 Sundays. But actually the next Sunday, we are going to continue our mediumship education. I'm going to present the next chapter of our medium mystic mediumship education. I was looking at here. The next one is as intelligent manifestations. So we're going to do that, a lecture next Sunday. Okay. Elmo, can you do our final prayer?
Sure. Let us try to calm down our minds, our hearts. And reflect on the hard work of so many missionaries sent by our Master at the moment of crisis. And express our gratitude to them for their effort, for Christ, for the perennial vigilance to continue to shepherd us at all times. And very far from considering ourselves any major missionary of anything, we ask our beloved Master to guide and inspire us, to do our best to spread his teachings with our behavior, to do our best to be a servant at his hands, so his teachings may prevail for the benefit of the entire human race on this planet. We ask, dear God, that you may have a blessed, peaceful, productive week in the work of goodness with good health of the body and of the mind, and permission to close this meeting. So be it.